So it's clear that when we speak of technological essence, and somebody would say, speak of a cell phone or a computer, then we would want to caution them and say, well, that's not what Heidegger's talking about is more pervasive than that, and it compels us at a different level than that, different in a different region. But on the other hand, there is a great ambiguity, because if you think of such things as Descartes and Descartes understanding all things as mechanical, and the corresponding view of the sciences as everything is about motion, where time and space can be understood in terms of measurable motion, and in some way the Galileo is saying that the universe is mathematical, and that we can read using math, we can put tags on everything and read the book of the night, as it were, but that will be the night sky, the stars, the way the stars move and stuff, thinking of observations by Kepler and so on. And well, later on when Dude develops his talk of the elliptical motion and all these things, where it becomes ambiguous whether any longer there's an internal, it makes any sense to talk in the Aristotelian sense of the nature of forms of life, of the internal principle of motion anymore, or whether we're just observing things in the positive sense. It does indeed seem that technological essence is almost identical to saying everything is understood as a machine. So in this sense, it does mean, the technological essence does mean machinery has become the understanding of all things. On the other hand, I would want to say there should be a subtle distinction should be possible with respect to the difference between the current reigning essence, the technological essence, but then the field with which Dasein is in, because we have, or more, let's make it a simpler distinction, the distinction between metaphysics as presence, as everything understood, the theory of the so-called theory of the object, the theorist and his object thinking out of the logos, where the logos makes everything into the house of being, and the technological essence. I think there is some subtle nuance with which we can see the distinction between metaphysics as presence, as the so-called positing by language, and technological essence. Technological essence is an episode in the unfolding of metaphysics. It's not quite identical. It is, though, however, one should keep in mind, it is quite a bit like understanding everything like a machine. That's, but of course, extending to everything, not just machines, to our body, to our mind, to anything we can possibly think of. So, in this sense, how does that link up with what Heidegger, the problem Heidegger is raising here when he says the power to impose itself, comma, indispensable to worldview, comma, is the essential consequence of the abandonment of beings by being. And so the power to impose itself, indispensable to worldview, is the essential consequence of the abandonment of beings by being. And he also says here, what I was reading before, when historiology is determined from a worldview, and for the latter, this is itself a historical moment of a specific kind, the more resolutely and the more clearly it is carried out, the more unequivocal is the event. So we have talk of the resolution in carrying out this determination from a worldview. which in a way this stick of dynamite equipped with human consciousness and language. Nietzsche is showing us the quintessential, or the, let's say, the supreme example of that in all his thinking, especially of the life-giving lie and the Übermensch. So the view Heidegger, let's say more or less, liberalism means the same as the view of progress. They more or less coincide. So if we have this Weltanschauung of progress, then, and there's another citation here where Heidegger says, why not master one's quote-unquote courage and declare that the sciences are essentially dependent? So in other words, dependent on this Weltanschauung of progress or liberalism, in such a way that the reason the sciences are the main, the chief activity of all human beings on the earth today, STEM and so on, with its great prestige, which is only slightly concealed by the fact that we have this, right now in the current period, it's slightly masked by the fact that there's a great, there's many episodes of scientists coming out and presenting all kinds of value. They use their scientific credentials to say things which aren't science qua science, but rather are all kinds of personal views that they have about values and so on, which they have a platform to do because of the great authority of the sciences, because of the Weltanschauung of progress, which ultimately makes people think we'll become happy, because not because all the confusion in the political sphere and everything else, where everyone's where many people are somewhat pessimistic, or in any case they're excited by the contests in the public sphere, or they're worried about it, or so on, but rather because the underlying view is that through STEM, through the hard sciences and so on, the world will be transfigured, human beings will be made happy, and so on. So this view being in the background, so to the extent that it's still believed, Heidegger is saying we're selling science as though this were true, because the worldview has so much power over us. And this worldview might, if it were actually carried out in a conscious way, we could even say that it was a life-giving lie from Nietzsche's point of view. But it's as though it's just part of the facticitat, part of what we're straddled, what we've been made to bear, as it were, through their thrownness. It's just here. It's not as though we have taken a stance that we're steadfastly, resolutely decided to go along with this. Somebody, to some extent, somebody like Pinker would be more, at least in some way, he's willing this to come forward. He wants this view to be. In other words, if he were free, if he weren't compelled in any way, this would be what he would do. Whereas quite a few people simply don't have a position on it, and in Pinker's case, I don't think he's felt the impelling force at a deep enough level to really take him seriously. And also there's certain, Zizek, for instance, points out certain kind of gross errors in Pinker, and I point out some errors in Pinker in his sort of gross empiricism, which seems inadequate. But so the word I find the most worthy of pondering further is, again, this saying that when historiology is determined from a worldview, and for the latter, this itself is a historical moment of a specific kind. So what do we mean here? So we have the current situation. So let's say, just make it more simple, progress is determining our way of understanding science. And we should remember that here Heidegger is thinking of historiology. The word ology is like a form like all the rest of the sciences, biology and psychology and so on. So he wants us to understand historiology as part of the group of sciences, of science, capital S science, which is being it's obscured what's happening with science because this background power of the progress view, which you see all the time in the social context of the view of, like the example I gave of the American law schools, with more women being produced in the law school as lawyers, more female lawyers being produced than there ever have been. And in the past, for thousands of years, there were no female lawyers at all, and all kinds of things that need the rights to marriage in different ways, and things, all kinds of things, give the view of progress this sort of ostensive sheen, and this great imaginative force goes into all this in the public sphere, and so there's an obscurity there, and then the criteria by which we determine whether history is a science or not gets read out of this fact-value distinction. But what does it mean that all this, which is sort of, I suppose all this we can call, what we've been thrown into, is historial. It's part of the destiny of being. It's part of the truth of being, and it's a specific historical moment. Now, there's in a certain sense that he speaks of the resoluteness with which the worldview controls the view of science, as though he were presenting Nietzsche's kind of view of the power of the will as the locus of freedom. But then we can see that that's not true, because he says that all what's happening here is due to the abandonment of beings by being. So we should try to several thoughts together into one thought. Even if the clarity there only brings us into the everyday vagueness that you're full of that, at least it gives us an approach